and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and we are live on all sorts of platforms, Rumble, Locals, YouTube, Twitter. So I hope everyone can hear me. If there are any issues with the audio, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll start. So today is June the 4th. Now, June the 4th may not mean that much to many people, but to Hungarians, it's actually quite a big day because on June the 4th, 1920, Hungary was forced to sign the Treaty of Trianon, by which Hungary lost more than 2/3 of its territory and more than 1/3 of its population found itself outside of the. So Master 7J Wolf says it's good. So thank you. I'm happy. And so, yeah, more than 1/3 of the Hungarian population found itself outside of the territory of Hungary. So the Kingdom of Hungary was no more. Hungary became a landlocked country, lost quite a lot of its economic potential because some of its industry ended up in other people's lands. Hungary was also forced to pay war reparations, and so I'm glad people are joining. So for Hungarians, it's really a very painful day. The era of Austria-Hungary, from the time of the establishment of the dual monarchy in 1867 to the World War I to 1914, was an era of some happiness for the Hungarians. Probably one of the happiest eras in its history, and it had to endure the more than 200 years of rule by the Ottomans. And then, of course, it had to endure the subordination to the Habsburgs. But the dual monarchy kind of recognized the status of Hungary. But the partition of Hungary was very, very painful. And in every case, it was always very detrimental to Hungarian interests, because it's true that in all the territories that were lopped off from Hungary, the majority population was non-Hungarian. However, it invariably resulted in Hungarians ending up in other people's lands. So it didn't really, any kind of national self-determination never really applied to Hungarians. But the Viktor Orban gave a speech today about Trianon, and he really mentioned that, well, if you feel pain on June the 4th, that means you're a Hungarian. It's the definition of a Hungarian if you feel pain on June the 4th. So it was really rather particularly painful for Hungarians, because Hungary really wasn't one of the key players in the crisis of 1914 that led to the to a war. In fact, Hungary urged caution. It was the Austrians who were really anxious to start the war against Serbia. Hungary really didn't think that was such a great idea. And indeed, it never really made a great deal of sense. And we've talked about this before. Quite how Austria-Hungary was going to solve its problems by a war against Serbia, even assuming Austria-Hungary could defeat Serbia, which was, as we turned out in 1914, was not by no means a done deal. Serbia was actually a very formidable fighting force, and let's leave aside the reasonable likelihood that Russia was going to come in to the war on Serbia's side, but even if Austria-Hungary could have pulled off victory against Serbia, it's not immediately clear why would that have solved Austria-Hungary's nationalities problem, which was clearly, at least the Germans believed that somehow that it was the nationalities problems that was weakening Austria-Hungary. So it's not clear why that would have, that in itself would have solved its problems. And I think that was the reason why Hungary was by no means signed up for this supposedly quick victory over Serbia that was going to deliver. But anyway, Hungary, which really wasn't keen on this war, but Hungary got paid the highest price because, of course, we know about the price that Germany paid. It lost a lot of territory on the east, that became Poland, but it didn't lose anything like the territory that Hungary lost. So Hungary paid the harshest price, and then, of course, in 1941, Hungary had made a fatal mistake because it wasn't exactly aligned with Hitler, but Hitler did promise and delivered a revision of the Treaty of Trianon. Hungary accepted the revisions, so Hungary got back some of Romania, some of the lands that were given to Romania, some of the lands that were given to Slovakia, or Czechoslovakia. Interestingly, both Romania and Slovakia, who lost territory to Hungary, nonetheless remained allies of Hitler's. But that step, whereby Hungary accepted the revisions of the Treaty of Trianon, effectively made Hungary an ally of Hitler's, and then of course it was formalized by the fact that Hungary joined in the onslaught on the Soviet Union in 1941. So Hungary then paid a substantial price. Not as a severe price as the one after World War I, but nonetheless a considerable price, which was Soviet rule from 1947, when communist rule was formalized, through to 1989. The interesting thing is that the Hungarians who rail against Trianon, they also rail against the Russians, but Russia really had nothing to do with Trianon. Trianon was imposed on Hungary by the Allied powers, the Entente powers, England and France, to whom Hungary apparently looks up to. Russia, or at least the Soviet Union, was as hostile to the post-World War I peace treaties. So it wasn't just the Versailles, but there was a number of these peace treaties, and Lausanne, and the Treaty of Sèvres, and so on. These were all there was a series, including Trianon. So there was a series of these peace treaties. The Soviet Union was hostile to all of them. Because the Soviet Union obviously was very concerned about the creation of these, the Little Entente, these small states that were wedged between Germany and the Soviet Union, aligned with France and were obviously very hostile to the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was very hostile to the creation of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, and so again, Soviet Union had nothing to do with Trianon. But the Hungarians, they rail about the Soviet rule after World War II, and it was no fun, though communism, in during the Kadar era, the sort of goulash communism, so-called, it wasn't really that bad. I mean, it was certainly fairly tolerant, much more tolerant and civilized than some of the communist regimes, in the rest of the Soviet bloc. But nonetheless, I mean, it was an inevitable outcome of World War II, and I think Hungarians often forget that you entered the war in on Hitler's side. You invaded the Soviet Union on Hitler's side, and then you lost. You ended up on the losing side. What did you think was going to happen? I mean, you're going to have to pay a price. The price Hungary paid, as I say, was not as severe as the price that it paid after World War One, but in which really it didn't have much of a role in instigating. But I think Orban, brings this up. So he spoke today about Trianon, and then on Saturday he spoke about the mad rush to war that he's says he's resisting, and says that Europe is absolutely determined to go to war against Russia. He says, I've taken part in these NATO meetings, and what's discussed at the NATO meetings is plans to go to war against Russia. And he said, well, we're not going to do it. We've done, we did it twice in the 20th century, in World War I, World War II. Each time we paid a heavy price. World War I, we got Trianon. World War II, we got 40 years of communist rule. We're not going to do it a third time. And so he says that NATO is pushing for this, yet another war. This is a third war by the West against Russia. We're not going to take part in this war, and if push comes to shove, we're just going to opt out. Didn't specify what opt out means, but you'd have to assume opt out means leaving NATO. Now, I don't know how feasible that plan is, because I don't think you can just simply opt out of NATO, because I don't think NATO will tolerate it. But I mean, but it's hard to do much about Orban. I mean, Orban enjoys considerable popularity in Hungary, and while yes, if you go to Budapest, like many urban conurbations, it tends to be kind of liberal, leftish, usual kind of boring, politically correct, woke way. They like all the stuff about, multiculturalism, gay marriage, the usual crap you get everywhere. So that you get that in Budapest. You don't get too much of that outside of the city. But even in the city, the people who detest Orban kind of like his foreign policy. They don't want to get involved in NATO's wars, and I think Orban understands this, that whatever people may feel about him and about Fidesz, they don't want to be sucked into a war. It's just that it does touch Hungarians in a very, I don't know, very emotional way, because it does remind them of unhappier times. Because basically, Hungary really has had a very unhappy history since 1914, and the feelings that something like that's going to happen again. That there is this war between NATO and Russia. Hungary is going to pay the price. Hungary is right there in the middle. It's very close to Russia. It's going to pay the heaviest price. And so, whatever their own feelings about Orban, and they don't like all his conservatism. They don't like his whole invocation of Christian civilization. They don't like his anti-immigrant policies, but they do like the fact that he wants to keep Hungary out of NATO's wars. But we'll see what happens, because, as I say, NATO has never really had a situation in which somebody wanted out. I mean, we had in the EU Brexit, and that was obviously a severe blow for the EU, but it could weather it, because far more important than the EU is NATO, and because Britain is a key NATO power, it didn't really matter that much. But we've never had a situation in which a country withdrew from NATO. I'm thinking, there have been various times in the past during the Cold War, and a kind of long ago and far away, when people are afraid. We had Andreas Papandreou in Greece. People were afraid, oh my God, Greece is going to withdraw from NATO. Never happened. And then, of course, even before that, we had the Italian communists. There was a moment when in the early mid 1970s, when it seemed like the Italian communists were going to enter the government, and then that would be somehow the end of NATO. And Henry Kissinger, we will have to make a serious reassessment of our commitment if the Italian communists come to power. So the usual stuff, but it never happened. So, we come to the brink, with parties of the left that they might withdraw their countries from NATO. It was always a dud. But now we have sort of a party of the right making that decision about NATO, and we'll see. There's no question they want Orban out. They want election after election. The Europeans and the Americans keep pushing for alternatives to Orban. They found another one, some guy called Peter Magyar, but he's obviously yet another dud, like Markizai, that was in the last election. Caraccio, and there's a whole bunch of these non-entities whom the West pushes as the alternatives to Orban. There's no chance that any of them have any kind of standing to push him out. So that, I think, isn't going to happen. But we'll see what happens if Orban pushes forward for withdrawal from NATO. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the questions which people have raised. So we'll go back. So I'm going to look first on the locals page, where some very good, so we have Cynthia, who says, as you know, George, DOS seized this. Oh, the DOS. It's writing it like DOS. Yeah, Department of State seized Scott Ritter's passport on his trip to Russia, but they didn't do the same to two other Xenon Russophiles, Larry Johnson and you say Jay Napolitano. Jay, like I'm now supposed to say Judge Napolitano. I will not say Judge Napolitano. I will say Andrew Napolitano, because, and I said this before, I'm not going to call him Judge. he hasn't been a judge in more than 30 years, and you don't just get a permanent title. When you hold a position, you hold a position. It's not just a permanent title that you hold for the rest of your life. So anyway, Andrew Napolitano, why is that so? And will the State Department also start targeting any other U.S. citizens who are outspoken critics of U.S. foreign policy, not just the ones who are Xenon Russophiles? Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question, Cynthia. Ritter, I think, has gone. Yeah, I don't know why they've isolated. I mean, I can see why Napolitano, that it wouldn't apply to Napolitano, because the guy had been a Fox News commentator for many years, a legal analyst, and he had obviously is now been quite critical of American foreign policy, Israel, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, he's still a Fox News analyst, of long standing, so that they'd give him a pass. Larry Johnson, I don't know, because he visited Russia recently, and gave a talk at a recent conference in Moscow. I guess Ritter is a little bit more of a controversial figure. I mean, he his own kind of checkered history with when he was a weapons inspector, and he came into conflict with the Clinton administration, and obviously some of his he had some legal issues, but I don't know exactly why they've taken that step with Ritter. I don't know. There may there may be other things that we don't know about as yet. That there could be something that we don't know, but it's not immediately obvious. Why would they isolate? Why would they do this to Ritter but not to Larry Johnson? As I say, Napolitano, I can understand, but Larry Johnson, like Ritter, he had served in the U.S. military. I mean, again, I could talk about, Ritter has had some criminal convictions, but that's of course all in the past. I wouldn't explain the issue of the passport. But Ritter, I think, unlike Johnson, I think he works for. He does work for RT, though I assume that he's under contract to RT, so he's not like, he's an RT contributor, so I assume they pay him for his contributions. He's not an employee of RT, I assume. Again, I don't know the deal, but at the same time, it's not. RT is not illegal in the United States, so he's not breaking any U.S. law. So I don't know now. So your next question is, will the DOS start targeting any other U.S. citizens who are outspoken critics of U.S. foreign policy, just like the one who are Xenon Russophiles? Well, I would think yes. I think the answer is, if we head towards war, then yeah, those there will be. They will start targeting many people. And so it may be that this is just a preliminary, a kind of a warm up to that to targeting others. So Ritter is the first because of all the people that you mentioned, he is, I think, the most controversial, probably the one who's probably gone the furthest in identifying himself with with Russia. I mean, in other words, he's embraced and championed Russia's cause, maybe a little more strongly than the others that you mentioned. So, but again, that that's neither here nor there as far as the First Amendment is concerned. So maybe they're trying to make an example of Ritter. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know on what basis you can just simply take someone's passport away. I mean, that just if he's not under indictment. So that it's obvious violation of his rights. On the innumerable amendments, First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, Fourth Amendment. You could rattle off all the rights that have been violated. But yeah, I mean, I think if we head towards war, then there's going to be a lot more of these crackdowns on anyone who has any kind of association with Russia, does any work for the Russian government, makes trips to Russia. So yeah, that's right. Now in the UK, I think it's already a lot more severe, because in the UK, RT has been made illegal. So in the UK, if you're working for RT, I think you can already be arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Just like those women getting arrested and convicted who are prey outside abortion clinics. They get arrested in Britain and sent to prison. So if you do work for RT, you could also end up in prison in Britain. So I think that as things keep escalating, I would think there's going to be a more of these crackdowns. We'll have to see what else is going on. Whether they have something else on Ritter at this stage that we don't know about. I doubt it, but it's possible. But it could also be. So Mary Grossman mentions about the pedophilia and so on around Ritter. I mean, I was talking about his criminal convictions, but the thing is that was also a long time ago, and he's done his time. I mean, that's it. He did his. He was prosecuted. He was punished very harshly, I think, but nonetheless, that's done. So I don't know on what basis you can use that to take away his passport. Now maybe they're doing something along those lines. They're saying, oh well, he's not supposed to travel, but according to his probation or so on. But that hasn't come up at all before. I mean, he's been doing a lot of traveling over the years, and no one this issue has never been brought up before, that this somehow is a violation of his terms of probation. So that doesn't really make much sense. Now Ritter, I mean, from the story in RT, he's talking about the issue that we talked about yesterday, which is the Clooney dossier, that how they're snitching out what they call propagandists for the Russian government. That means journalists who work for RT and Sputnik. And Ritter seemed to think that has something to do with it. But I don't know. Again, even if you have let's say, even if the U.S. government accuses someone of being a propagandist, that doesn't make it a violation of the law, because that's still in accord with the First Amendment. The First Amendment allows you to be a propagandist for anyone else. If it's against the law, one would have to say, well, are we at war with Russia? If so, we should, the U.S. government should tell people that we're at war with Russia, and that and that therefore it's a crime to be a propagandist on behalf of Russia. But since we're not at war with Russia, the war has not been declared, then on what basis you can just simply start persecuting anyone you claim to be a propagandist? So I don't see that. And again, the issues of his past criminal convictions, I think that's over and done with. So I don't know how you can just suddenly bring it up now all of a sudden. So Mary Grossman says, Michael Brenner on Dialogue Works today mentioned neo-fascist parties appearing in Europe, now Netherlands and Austria some years ago. Are most European countries now fascist ruled? No, of course not. I think that there's a lot of anxiety. I mean, we have the European elections that are coming up on Sunday. And there's obviously anxiety on the part of the EU leadership that, and of course the media invariably just act as the mouthpiece of the EU leaders, that somehow they're going to be all these right-wing populists who are going to do well in this election, and that's going to challenge the EU leaders, and above all, it's going to challenge the EU's signature policy, which is the war in Ukraine. I mean, the EU has made that as its signature policy. Now, I have my doubts. I have my doubts that the populists are going to do that well. There's obviously going to be a swing to the right, but I don't think there's going to be any decisive shift. I mean, the country that we were watching was Germany, with the Alternative für Deutschland party, because of course, if they do well, that's in the most important country in Europe, and if they make a significant showing, that's going to have an effect on Germany's commitment to this war in Ukraine. But it's clear that this massive operation that has been undertaken against the Alternative für Deutschland, they've been accused of working for Putin. They've been accused of working for China. They've been accused of covering up for the Nazis. Just everything under the sun has been thrown against them. So, and I think it's had an effect. They want to deport all the migrants. They want to bring in a fascist dictatorship and so on. But that's had an effect, and they in the polls, they have dipped from their peak when they're, when about a year ago, when they were in the mid-20s. Now, their poll numbers are substantially less, 18 or so on. I don't think you're going to do that well. And I think that's the one. But there's, every time there's an election, there's always this, the EU and the media acolytes want to create this panic about the populist right, the fascist populist right, that is waiting in the wings to come to power. And you can always do it because you always have to say, oh, well, these are the fascists. So these are fascists. So interestingly, the what they call the populist right also happen to be very pro-Israeli. And that's an interesting aspect of what's called the populist right. So they're apparently very nationalist, very much into national sovereignty and so on. But they seem to be very strangely pro-Israeli. So Geert Wilders, very pro-Israeli. All the people in Italy, all the the Italian populists very pro-Israeli, Orban himself very pro-Israeli. So it's I mean, Israel, I think, has worked to cultivate that nationalist populist right in Europe, and show, hey, we're with you. Your agenda is our agenda. We believe in national sovereignty. No more woke. No more supranational entities. No more globalism. We want nation state, national sovereignty, and so on. So Israel been very very clever in doing that. So yeah, I just don't. I don't see it's going to be a significant factor. Before the election or after the election. So then Cynthia says, on RT the other day, you said something like, great powers refuse to accept defeat because if they do, they'll be viewed as paper tigers and thus cease to be great powers. Yeah, it sounds like something I'd say. But that didn't happen when the US lost its proxy war in Vietnam. And even after putting its own troops on the ground, the war certainly proved the US is nothing but a paper tiger, but it still has maintained itself as a great power. So why can't that also be the case with US proxy war in Ukraine? Well, that's an excellent question. And I think that's a very important issue that you've raised there, Cynthia, because the point about Vietnam was that it's a colonial war. Now, a great power can accept not exactly defeat in the colonial war, but it can decide that this war isn't worth the candle, that the price of continuing it is too high for whatever gains it may get down the road. So with Vietnam, I mean, there was no one had any doubt that the United States can obviously pulverize North Vietnam any day that it wishes. I mean, it could just simply wipe it off the map. That there was never really any issue there. I mean, there was a outside chance that China would get in on behalf of North Vietnam, but it wasn't really very likely. Nor was it likely that the Soviet Union would go to war on behalf of North Vietnam. So the question was, this was part of a Cold War and a decision not to allow countries to, again, countries on the periphery. Vietnam was very much on the periphery, a very poor peasant country. So it was a country on the periphery. Will it be a part of the Soviet bloc? Well, it was obvious that this was really a very small potatoes. So in 1972, when Richard Nixon essentially made the decision to bring the U.S. Involvement in Vietnam to an end, he at the same time was playing a complicated geopolitical game with Russia, with the Soviet Union and China, signing major arms control agreement. In other words, if you looked at the world in 1972, you suddenly saw really Vietnam is a very small potatoes. Because there's so much bigger things going on in the world. The sort of balance of power between China and the Soviet Union. This is a major arms control agreement. It didn't really matter whether a peasant society will be wholly run by the communists or whether it'll be partitioned and the war would just continues between the non-communist, anti-communist South and the communist North. So you could do that and basically say, look, our power isn't diminished. It's just that we don't think it's worth our time to go on fighting this colonial war. I mean, after all, the British withdrew from their colonies in the 1950s and 60s. The French withdrew from Algeria. each of these decisions was saying, look, this is a colonial war. We can go on fighting this, impoverishing ourselves for years and years, but ultimately it doesn't affect our standing in the world. What does affect your standing in the world is when you fight powers that are your equals and you lose. Because if you lose against a power that is your equal, then you cease to be a great power. And then, who knows what the consequences are. But the consequences are clearly serious. So what happened in World War I and World War II was that the great powers at the time went to war against one another. And as a consequence of both world wars, they were substantially diminished, if not completely eliminated, as great powers. So that's kind of what I was saying, is that great powers only remain great powers if they avoid going to war against one another. If they go to war, obviously, if you win, then your power is greatly enhanced. If you lose, then then you got the problem. So Soviet Union entered the war in Afghanistan. It didn't do that badly. It certainly did better than the United States subsequently. But when it withdrew in 1989, it wasn't that big a deal. I mean, some people who want to say, "Oh, it was a big deal," and it really wasn't a big deal. They just said, again, we devoted 10 years to this. It's just not worth more time and resources and so on. So now Ukraine is a very different case, because here this is a direct confrontation between a united West, a West united under the auspices of United States and NATO against Russia. Well, neither side can afford to back down. I mean, NATO backs down and admits that that they failed to make a dent when Russia, they basically pooled their resources, clearly devoted themselves to fighting this proxy war against Russia, and then they lost. Then that's a humiliation for NATO. Is it the end of NATO? I don't know. Who knows? But once you lose, you never know what the consequences are going to be. And the same thing with Russia. If Russia loses, then again, who knows what the consequences are? I mean, we saw what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, the existence of Russia was quickly called into question. If Russia loses this war, I mean, it's not just going to be Putin, who will be overthrown, but the very existence of the Russian state will be in question. So neither side can afford to back down, precisely because it is two great powers confronting each other. So that's why it's very different from Vietnam, because neither the Soviet Union nor China went all in for North Vietnam, and neither did the United States think it worth its time. The United States limited its goals to the maintenance of that non-communist, anti-communist government in Saigon. It never sought to topple the regime in Hanoi, and so given its limited goals, then the price that the United States was paying, because of course it was costing a lot of money, but also that it was getting it was still, the draft was still there. People were not at all happy about going off to fight in Vietnam. So it just wasn't worth the price. But the United States in no way lost its standing in the world. I mean, if you just look at the world in the 70s, the United States was still clearly the dominant power, and Vietnam was quickly forgotten as the significant, because it really wasn't that significant. Okay, the communists now control Southeast Asia. Just Southeast Asia is just too much of a backwater for anyone to be really thinking that, oh, now the balance of power has changed in the world. So I think that's kind of what I was getting at. And then Cynthia goes on. Okay, so perhaps US's proxy war in Ukraine is a bit different from the one it had in Vietnam, mainly due to Russia's direct participation in Ukraine, making it a proxyless war for Russia. Even so, the US can only get itself out of this war without losing face by simply claiming that the war was lost, or because Ukraine's top brass is incompetent and its men are lousy fighters. I think most of the world would buy into that, thus enabling the US to remain a great power. I don't think the US can do that exactly, because the US has backed Ukraine to the hilt, and has poured an enormous amount of resources into that, expressed repeatedly its confidence in Ukraine. But more important, the United States would then have to say that, having committed itself to Ukraine, it lost to Russia, directly to Russia. And therefore, the post-Cold War world, which, particularly in Europe, which was being dominated by the United States, both, that this was the dominance by the winners of the Cold War. We won the Cold War. We get to set the rules. We're going to make Russia pay for having lost the Cold War. That whole thing would be called into question. Every single aspect of that would be called into question, and therefore U.S. Rule, the U.S. Based order would be called into question, and Russia will be the overwhelming victor. The U.S. threw what it had at Russia. It wanted to throw more, but backed down out of fear of Russia, and then Russia emerges victorious. The U.S. couldn't live with that. It can't live with that, and it won't live with that. So that's why, the situation is rather dangerous, because I don't think the U.S. will accept defeat, and will therefore escalate to the next step. The Russians have clearly set out the outlines of a peace agreement that the Russians think will be acceptable to the West, without the West necessarily losing face. So in other words, Russians are quite concerned. They don't, they know that if the West loses face, then this will be unacceptable. And so, but the Russians have set out, which is something along the lines of a partition of Ukraine. So everybody then walks away with something. Russia acquires new territory. By no means everything that Russia was seeking. So not the whole of the Donbass, not the whole of Kherson and Zaporozhye, but nonetheless it would be additional territory. NATO and the United States get the rest. So whatever that comes to, 80% of Ukraine or whatever. So that way, NATO then walks away with something and say, well, we got something, got 80% of Ukraine, and we can do what we want with it. We can bring it into NATO, we can bring it into the EU, but we've got that. And then Russia obviously has something. It's acquired additional territory. And maybe it can think in terms of some demilitarized zone or something along those lines. That is what I think Russia is proposing, tacitly, whatever it's being proposed. The problem is that NATO is not accepting it. NATO doesn't want to accept it. NATO keeps wanting to escalate and to keep the war going, because, as I say, that deal, which I don't think it's a great deal for Russia, but if Russia wants to bring this war to an end, and essentially just to make sure that we don't end up in a global world war, so Russia said, okay, we'll settle for that. NATO isn't willing to settle for it, and I think that's why I think NATO just continues escalating, because they're just not willing to settle. They've never spelled out any terms that they'll settle for other than total Russian capitulation, which cannot happen. I mean, again, if Russia capitulates, then Russia's finished. So that's why I think I can't see any way out of this, at least for the foreseeable future. And then Cynthia says, but the biggest obstacle to this is President Zelensky. I see this is, all right, I'll finish this. But President Zelensky, most of which has to do with him being a Jew, it allows him to play the Jewish victimhood card whenever he doesn't get his way, and the US will fall for it, just like it does with Israel. It's like the US has another bratty Israel on his hands. Cutting us off is akin to throwing us back into the oven, cries Zelensky. So if we replace him with a blue-eyed, blonde, Nazi-looking guy, our trouble with Ukraine should end and for good. You see, the problem is that I think I agree with you partly. I think that Zelensky is a very useful tool for the West precisely because he's a Jew. And so therefore, all the talks of the Nazi Ukraine, Bandera, nostalgia for Hitler, the SS, and so on. So, well, how can that be? Zelensky is a Jew. And if you look at him, he looks very Jewish. I mean, there's no question. I mean, physically, he looks very Jewish. So it's not like, you can have some handsome blonde guy and say, well, he's a Jew. He doesn't look like a Jew, but Zelensky does look it. So I think that part I agree with, that he's very, very useful to the Western propaganda system. The part that I don't agree with is that Zelensky is the one calling the shots. Zelensky's not calling the shots. The Americans are calling the shots. The Americans are the ones who want to keep this war going. And luckily, they have a man totally irresponsible, a man, a completely disastrous leader in Zelensky, who is willing to go along with these plans. Because let's remember, Zelensky is elected in 2019 on a platform of reconciliation with Russia, reconciliation with the Donbass. Why doesn't that happen? Well, obviously there are these Nazi types who weren't going to allow him to do that, but the Western powers were not going to allow him to do that. And that's the crucial point. They made it clear to him that implementation of Minsk was a non-starter. Don't even think about it. And then, of course, we know what happened in 2022 when, again, negotiations in Minsk, negotiations in Istanbul, and it seemed like an agreement was close, and a very good agreement for Ukraine. It was not at all a good agreement for Russia. Russia was going to end up with less than it had before it launched the so-called special military operation. And we know what happened. Boris Johnson, and of course behind Boris Johnson was the Biden administration. They ended it. They sabotaged it. And from then on, the war that goes on is a war that is being driven by NATO. Zelensky is just a useful idiot for them. He's going along with this, something that is clearly, totally, utterly detrimental to Ukraine's interests, but he's going along with it. This is a NATO war. NATO wants to use Ukraine as a weapon at Russia, and Zelensky is more than willing to do it. So that's why I've said this many times here. All the talk that somehow they're going to throw Zelensky under the bus and so on, it's not going to happen. Why would they do that? Zelensky is the golden goose. Why would they kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? Oh, I always forget how it goes. They can't believe their good fortune that they have somebody like that in charge. So he's not the one calling the shots, and never has been. Anyway, thank you, Cynthia. So Robert then says, thank you, Robert. Scott Ritter, the day before he was escorted off his St. Petersburg-bound plane, made a truly chilling disclosure regarding the U.S. nuclear deterrent system. According to Ritter, nuclear deterrence, if activated, would not just strike Russia, but would target every other nation which could potentially emerge as a new hegemon. This would include China, India, China, and who knows who else. Well, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that the question of the nuclear deterrence is under what circumstances would the United States resort to nuclear weapons? I mean, as things stand, all the pressure that is being applied is pressure that's being applied against Russia. And Russia is the one that's being pushed against the wall, and Russia is the one that's being forced into making a decision as to how it should respond to, basically to this onslaught from NATO. I don't think the US would resort to nuclear weapons right away. I mean, I think that's going to take some time for that to happen. And again, if one imagines that, as NATO continues its escalation, I mean, we have to assume the United States is going to give more and more leeway to Ukraine to attack targets inside Russia. At what point does Russia, escalate? Russia has been very limited in its responses so far. So one escalation would be to hit U.S. satellites, the U.S. AWACS systems, U.S. drones in the Black Sea. That would be the next step. It's possible that they would hit bases, bases in, say, Poland, if those bases were being used to attack Russia. So if some F-16 aircraft were using the bases in Poland to attack Russia, then the Russians would hit those bases in Poland. So at that moment, the question then arises, well, does NATO invoke Article 5? There'll be pressure to do that, but there'll also be, it's going to be very difficult to know, because essentially NATO will be asking for the invocation of Article 5 in circumstances in which NATO has violated Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Remember, Article 1 says NATO cannot wage any kind of a war against the non-NATO powers. It must seek to resolve any disputes with a non-NATO power by exclusively peaceful means. So Article 5 only applies in circumstances in which an outside power makes an unprovoked attack on a NATO power. So it has to be unprovoked attack against a NATO power. So the NATO, which is supposedly a defensive alliance, can then say, okay, well, with that we can invoke Article 5. But if it's a case that NATO has been involved, as we know, it's been involved in waging this war against Russia on Russian territory, it's hard to see how do you invoke Article 5? You have violated Article 1. You have got yourself into a war with Russia in Ukraine. Neither Russia nor Ukraine is a member of NATO. You've got yourself involved in that. And if Russia has retaliated against you, then Russia has retaliated, against you. You have violated Article 1. If you violate Article 1, you can't then turn around and invoke Article 5. Now, that's an argument that will doubtless be put forward by Viktor Orban, but there'll be others within NATO who will, of course, say, no, Article 5, Article 5. Again, and as we've talked about this before, Article 5 does not commit anyone to go to war. Article 5 means, hey, all for one and one for all, and what? And every NATO member state makes its decision according to its means as to what it's going to do to help the NATO member state that is under attack. But if you attack Poland, let's say if Poland has come under attack because Poland has been using its military bases to make attacks on Russian territory, it's very hard to see how any attack on Poland merits Article 5. It's Poland that has waged an aggressive war against Russia in violation of the North Atlantic Treaty. Okay, you're not supposed to do that. It's supposed to be entirely defensive. You're not supposed to go outside your zone. So you violated that. You can't very well then turn around and invoke Article 5. So, but let's say it does happen. I think the United States will be very wary of reaching for its nuclear weapons. So if it does go for Article 5 and if it decides to retaliate against Russia for, let's say, for attacks against its satellite systems, or if against the AWACS system, or if it's against whatever, again, any attack on Polish territory, I think it's going to be. It's going to hesitate before it reaches towards nuclear weapons. Well, that doesn't mean that it won't go. That it's not going to lead to nuclear weapons. But I think it's not going to be nuclear right away. But who the hell knows? I mean, we're in such completely uncharted territory, and the U.S. has behaved so recklessly up until now that one can't know what the hell is it going to do. We shouldn't really be in this position when we're speculating about these kinds of events. But I'm assuming that initially, at least, if the U.S. does decide to strike targets in Russia, it's going to hold back on its nuclear force. Judy Hotchkiss, Judy, welcome. If a nuclear exchange between U.S. and Russia will end civilization anyway, I don't know why we would worry about the rest. Okay, that's a fair point. I agree with that. It's going to end human life altogether, and animal life and everything else. So yeah, that's I agree. Anyway, Anna Marie, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Valerie, thank you so much. Really appreciate you. Yes. And Valerie says it's good to be with you all during these turbulent times. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Valerie. Dan Rock says, almost good morning for me. Good to be here with you. Thank you. And that Dan Rock, always good to welcome you here. Dan Rock says, does Orban have the power to throw out that openly hostile American ambassador? If so, why doesn't he? That's a good question. Of course, he does have the power. Of course, he can always declare the ambassador a persona non grata, but he doesn't do it. I mean, but Orban has already made his feelings plain when it comes to the United States politics, which is quite unusual for. I mean, I think generally for any head of government to declare openly whose side you are on in the coming election. And he's openly said, He wants Trump to win. A civilization rests on Trump, and so he wants Biden gone. So he wants Biden administration, Blinken, all of them, and including Samantha Power and the U.S. ambassador. I mean, I guess yes, you could kick him out, but almost certainly he's going to be replaced by somebody exactly the same. It's not. It's not going to achieve anything concrete for Orban, because if he is thrown out, I mean, you can be sure the Biden administration will find someone even worse, if that's possible, than the current ambassador. So it'll be, I think Orban just won't achieve anything by this. So you just have to put up. I mean, he was appointed with a view to annoying Orban as much as possible. He's gay. He has a husband. And so on. So Hungary. I mean, generally it's a conservative country. I mean, Budapest not so much, but Hungary by and large is quite conservative, and Orban certainly has been advocating conservative social values. So it was done, to rub his nose in it. But yeah, kicking him out it just won't achieve anything for him. There'll just be somebody exactly the same, if not worse, to replace him. R. Brown, 1958, says, to put it in European terms, during the Trump interregnum, Viktor Orban has emerged as regent for a mostly conservative Christian and nationalist movement in the Western world. Yeah, okay. I think it's interesting. Yeah, that places Hungary at the forefront of the defense of a shared Christian history since 1214 AD. God bless Viktor Orban and every Hungarian that supports him. I think that's very true. I think he would certainly say that he is. I mean, he in a way blazed the trail for Trump with his Orban in 2015. Who I think first emerged on the kind of international scene with his really vehement opposition to the mass migration into Europe, because when Angela Merkel kind of invited in the migrants from the Middle East, and he kind of said absolutely explicitly, we are not going to take anyone in. That, of course, put him into direct confrontation with the EU, with Angela Merkel. But what was important is that he blazed the trail for Trump. Trump kind of adopted that view. I mean, yes, there had been anti-immigrant populists before him. Salvini had done this, but Orban had done it in the most vehement way, and then Orban took up and then Trump took up the charge. But it is interesting. I mean, that Trump hasn't quite adopted that social conservatism, and maybe you can't do it in America. I mean, it's not Hungary. I mean, America's a much more liberal, much less homogeneous place. The kind of social conservatism that Orban espouses, that it obviously has supporters among American conservatives. I mean, there's no question he's a hero to American conservatives, to CPAC, and so on. I mean, he's been invited to CPAC conferences. CPAC has these conferences in Hungary, but it's still kind of, it's not anything that's going to win an election for a Republican. I mean, it's just it. I mean, it's just America in 2024 is just not certainly not the America of 1964, and it's certainly not anything like Hungary. Nonetheless, I mean the Trump, or I mean the real question is the peace. And because Orban has explicitly stated, and he said this over and over again, because what really the reason why Orban is supporting Trump is that Trump will bring peace. Trump will keep America out of wars, and Trump will make sure that this war in Ukraine will come to an end. That's what Orban has said. And he said this after he met Trump in Mar-a-Lago a few months ago. And then Orban came out and said, yeah, well, Trump told me that he's going to cut off aid to Ukraine. And that's the secret plan to bring in the war to an end. And of course, that is the plan. I mean, there's no other way you can bring this to an end unless other than bringing to an end. You can't do it. You can't, have any other plan but to say enough. We're not going to do it anymore, and that's it. We're not going to support Ukraine. We're going to accept peace terms on the current lines of conflict. If that's available, that is available. I think Russia's made clear that's available, and that's it. We're not going to keep funneling money to Ukraine. We're not going to keep fueling the war. That's what Orban suggested Trump was committed to. Trump has never said that. It's I think it's rather troubling, but he hasn't really said that is. I mean, there are those people like Michael Tracy who somehow make Trump the key figure in the recent Republican $61 billion that was sent to Ukraine. But Trump was not the key player in all that. Trump kind of endorsed Johnson's plan, but it didn't matter because Johnson was going to bring this to the floor. Johnson is the Speaker of the House. The votes were always there, even though half the GOP in the House, more than half, voted against it. There was still, because 100% of the Democrats voted for it, that was going to happen. So Trump wasn't the key player in all of that. It was basically when Johnson allowed it to go to the floor, Trump couldn't stop that. It was Johnson's decision. So, but nonetheless, we don't know what Trump will do. So Zelensky said the other day, if Trump tries to force a peace on me, Trump will be a loser and so on. But we really don't know. I mean, it may be that Trump told Orban, yeah, that's my plan. Or maybe Orban heard what he wanted to hear, but we really don't know what Trump will do. As I said before, I'm not at all happy with the people around Trump. If you're a peace candidate, what the hell are you doing with creatures like Sebastian Gorka around you? So anyway, then Dan Rock says France under de Gaulle left NATO and threw them out, sent them packing to Brussels. Well, yes and no. France withdrew from the integrated military command of NATO, but France remained a member of NATO. And you're right, the headquarters of NATO was in France, and de Gaulle kicked them out, and the headquarters moved to Brussels. But France remained in NATO. It just withdrew from the integrated military command. So in effect, France was a de facto member of NATO, but France, liked to, posture, we have our own independent foreign policy, and so on and so forth. And then, nobody really took it terribly seriously, particularly once de Gaulle was gone, and all his successors, postured like de Gaulle, but in practical terms, they were pretty close to NATO. So I don't think anyone was ever under any illusion that France was not a member of NATO. Now, it's not a question of which I asked earlier. Will NATO? I mean, there was nothing much that they could do with de Gaulle. Well, who knows? It's still a mystery what happened to de Gaulle in '68. I mean, that was who knows what was behind that. That was a very, very strange event when the great de Gaulle was almost toppled. But you'd have to think something like that would be in the works in Hungary. France is France, but if Hungary, if you can't overthrow a government in Hungary, what can you do? There may be all sorts of scandals that are going to come up. We had the recent scandal. Of course, it wasn't a scandal, but there's going to be more of that. Some, pedophilia, and someone will go to the media running with, pedophilia crisis in Hungary, blah blah. Hungarian government, is involved in pedophilia. Of course, Hungarian government isn't involved in pedophilia, but you can imagine there are going to be more and more of these sorts of fake stories, and try to whip people out onto the street about these crises. So let me go back now. Thank you. Yes, okay. So then we have R. Brown says, thank you for a more granular history of Eastern Europe from 1920 to 47. Thank you. And then R. Brown says, Ritter is more vocal and visible than the other two. Yeah, I think so. I think so, because of the others. I don't think Larry Johnson is that well known. Napolitano is known, but they might just cut Napolitano some slack because, all those years he was the Fox News legal analyst. They might just not take him entirely seriously now that he's seems to have completely changed his the views that he had when he was at Fox News, when he was very anti-Russian, rabidly anti-Russian. I remember that. So, it may be that they just cut him slack. He's also a little older, so I think, well, okay, Fox News didn't treat him very nicely by firing him, after all those years of service. So they might feel that, well, just an old man, a little bitter about how he was treated. Ritter is no question. I think they do feel more bitter about Ritter. Ritter has a much higher profile, and again, I mean, he's been a kind of a national figure ever since 1998 when he attacked the Clinton administration. Then, of course, he attacked it for being too soft on Saddam Hussein. So, it makes sense for them to take him on, but I still don't quite see on what basis you can just simply take away his passport. I mean, you can't just take someone's passport. But what is it? Are they suspecting him of a crime? It's his basic right as an American citizen to travel wherever he wants. I mean, unless you want to say we're at war, but if we are at war, then you'd have to punish Johnson and Napolitano. So I don't know. I don't know. And again, maybe there's something else going on. As I say, maybe they're preparing some other criminal charges against Ritter. Who knows? But obviously, just seizing his passport is a fundamental violation of all of his rights. So Steve Brown says there is news on Twitter that Judge Knapp got the same treatment. Is that right? Okay, well, I'll look that up afterwards. And then Steve says, look what that vile empire did to Brad Manning. Ritter got off easy. Yeah. No, but so far. But Manning, I mean, if they accuse Manning of something, at least. I mean, Ritter, they can't really accuse. Ritter hasn't committed any crimes. I mean, other than the personal issues. But Manning, they accused of seizing classified documents. So, but yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no comparison with the way they treated him. And then Scott Ritter, this is Mary Grossman says, Scott Ritter per Jacob Dreisen mentioned Ritter as a foreign agent. What is that about? I don't know. I mean, I don't think that you. I mean, I think that if let's say he's getting money from he gets money for work that he does at RT. Does that make him a foreign agent? Well, to me, it doesn't make much sense. But I can see maybe they could try to build some case. I mean, yeah, I mean, again, I'm just so speculating here. But RT has been designated as a foreign agent. So that's it. That's what the U.S. government calls RT as a foreign agent. So Scott Ritter, who does work for RT. I mean, there's no secret of that. He does work. He obviously gets paid by RT. They might regard that as that means he's a foreign agent. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, what the law is on that, but presumably, if they say, well, RT is a foreign agent, then anybody who gets money from RT would be a foreign agent. Well, that could be quite problematic. I think that means for all RT contributors. I don't know whether, I mean, Johnson has contributed to RT, but I don't know whether Johnson has ever been paid by RT. But if that's the issue, that Scott Ritter is getting paid by RT, and that therefore that makes him a foreign agent, and he hasn't registered as a foreign agent. Well, then I guess that's going to be a warning for everybody in America that who goes on RT. Will make sure that you don't receive money from RT. But then it's you'd have to think. I mean, what about anybody else who gets money from any Russian entity? Does that make you a foreign agent? I mean, either way, if that's the issue, then why don't they bring that up as an issue? Then go to Scott Ritter and say, you are in violation of FARA because you haven't registered as a foreign agent, and then bring whatever criminal charges against him if that's the issue. But that seems to be something very different from just boarding a plane, seizing his passport. I mean, how can you just do that without bringing criminal charges? But yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see what that is. I mean, that it's certainly a shot. If the issue is if you're working for RT, if you're getting paid by RT, that means you're a foreign agent. That's a real warning shot. I mean, people, for people everywhere that you've got to be very careful. Anyway, Cynthia says Andrew Napolitano was on his way with Scott Ritter to give a talk at St. Petersburg, but decided to back out of the trip after Ritter was taken off the plane. Okay, so that means Napolitano is not going. Yeah, Peter's going to be there, I think, on Friday, but Peter, of course, is not. He's in Russia, so that's not an issue that arises for him. Steve Brown says, if you are in the former United States and a commentator, this is why it's so important to use a false name, be as anonymous as possible, and use VPN. Gradually, the feds will round up all journalists and bloggers critical of the former United States. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if you're receiving money for these entities, and I think, look, a lot of people, independent commentators, they're going to receive money. I mean, people need they need money to live. I mean, it's probably going to be extremely hard to bypass all of the surveillance, apparat of the United States, tracking all kinds of international transactions. So, so I don't know, but I mean, if you use a false name, I mean, then you don't really have the standing. I mean, Scott Ritter, he's a well-known person, so he has a certain standing. Anyway, Mary says, Ritter question I asked included being labeled as a foreign agent, as stated in the Dreisen report. Yeah, no, as I say, I think that could well be the issue that they want to make a FARA. But if FARA is the issue, then why haven't they brought FARA charges against him? They haven't. So they just simply seized his passport without really having brought charges. So I mean, you can bring charges and then confiscate someone's passport, but I don't know what basis you can, in the absence of criminal proceedings, you can just simply take someone's passport away. Anyway, Steve Brown, there's a picture of Napolitano. The lettering is tiny, so let me see if I can read it. Shock. The Biden regime, upon hearing former New Jersey Superior Court Judge Andrew Napolitano was speaking on a panel in Russia with a woman who has accused Biden of sexual assault, had police remove him from a plane and may have even seized his passport. Well, that's interesting. So, yes. Well, I mean, Tucker Carlson spoke to that woman. He ran an interview with her, and yeah, that is interesting. We have to see that whether, but that seems to be different from the story earlier, which is that Napolitano, when they seized Ritter's passport, he got off the plane as well. So that's interesting. Whether was this, did they target Napolitano? As Steve says, might be Twitter BS. Yeah. We'll have to see what happens. No question. And then anyway, R. Brown says, back in the 60s, 70s, the U.S. didn't fight to win. It was a managed perpetual war until people got tired of it. The U.S. wasn't a paper tiger then, either militarily or economically. Now it's a completely different time. The USA is militarily weak and economically weakening. Well, that's as may be. I think it's the United States can fight in Iraq, they can fight in Syria, they can fight in Afghanistan, but there's always a limit to to what they need to do. It's not you can wage these global war against terror and so on, but these are, I mean, they're basically fake wars. I mean, nobody really believed the United States was waging a war against terror. It was just a way of United States expanding its presence and influence in the Middle East, because we know that the source of terror in the world was Saudi Arabia. We know how they did it. We know about the madrasas. We know that everything. We know about the 9/11 attackers, that they originated in Saudi Arabia. We know that the United States has targeted for destruction regimes that hated Islamists, that persecuted and imprisoned and killed Islamists, and yet for some strange reason, the United States was always attacking Iraq, Libya, Syria, the secularist regimes that had nothing to do with Islamists. So the global war on terror was always a fraud. What we have now is so that was just a way of you're fighting a war for the sake of fighting a war. It's a way, basically, of maintaining your military presence, your influence, and justifying your military budget. But Russia is a different case, just like China is a different case, because now you're up against a peer. If you're a have to back down with your tail between your legs against a Russia or China, that puts you in a very dire position, because after all, the United States, whatever these problems that it has, it's still the global hegemon. It's still, the number one power. Yeah, China, is a big country and, produces a great deal, but China is not in any way a competitor to the United States, certainly not militarily, not even in terms of influence. I mean, China doesn't preside over a massive global military alliance system. All its satellite systems, intelligence, everything that the United States has. China doesn't have anything like that. So therefore, if you do all that, if you create this vast global military security apparatus, forcing everybody to take part in that, and then you come up against a peer power and you have to slink away, that's not good. Then you really do look like, hey, you've been bluffing all this time. So that's why I don't think the United States can back down, because you back down, suddenly you're not a great power anymore. But Vietnam just wasn't that significant, and that's why it was fairly quickly forgotten. That was when the U.S. withdrew its forces in January 1973. By the time the North Vietnamese mounted their offensive in 1975, nobody really cared anymore about Vietnam. I mean, Americans just didn't care. They just didn't think it affected them at all. It was kind of almost like a non-event. When the communists took this over, I think that would be, very different if America, faced a defeat in Ukraine. Anyway, Steve Brown, it's all about the shekels. Steve says Ukraine corruption is important to Western bankers. Yeah. Well, they're making a lot of money, no question. A lot of people are making a lot of money in Ukraine, but that's just it's like over-determination. There are a lot of there are many reasons why the United States and NATO are so heavily invested in Ukraine. There's the military, there are all the hedge fund bankers, and then of course you've got your geopolitical interest. You want to destroy Russia, you want to mobilize NATO, you want to cripple the European economy, you want to make sure everybody is subordinated to the master. There's many reasons, but that all only suggests that backing away from all that is going to be almost impossible for the United States. And as Steve says, I've seen it firsthand. Ukraine guys swindled a bank I worked for, $24 million. Ukraine criminal money laundering and weapons dealing is important to the West, not just what Israel does. Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're talking about a lot of money that's gone to Ukraine. I mean, where did it go? A lot of people have been making a lot of money, and these hedge fund guys, they're also in on it. They know that they're going to be making a lot of money because the government is going to underwrite all the loans that they extend to Ukraine. So for reconstruction, that's no question. Anyway, Steve says, U.S. still had economic and industrial primacy in 1975. Now the former United States is a fading military-industrial power and a declining hegemon, quite different than in 1975. I don't see it that way, because in 1975, you had the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union provided a serious challenge to the United States. I mean, not just ideologically, because it says, well, we've got our own social and economic system, but militarily. It had military parity with the United States. Imagine, it's a military parity of a power that is ostensibly very hostile to the United States. In Europe, just in terms of the European continent, most people would say the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, had military superiority over NATO. Should there be a war, the United States would have to resort to nuclear weapons almost immediately because of the conventional superiority of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And much of Asia, much of Africa, kind of looked upon the Soviet Union as a model. They kind of liked that whole state socialism that they practice. They liked the fact that the Soviets challenged Western imperialism, Western hegemony. Suddenly there was an alternative voice to Western hegemony. So in 1975, you looked at it and you could argue. I think it would have been wrong, and I think people did argue it. Some the anti-communists argued, hey, this is a major geopolitical defeat for the United States because it's a victory for our great adversary, and that the Soviet Union is just our implacable foe. There are no weaknesses there, and they're just pocketing this victory. Now, obviously that was not the correct analysis, but what I'm saying is that yes, the United States had economic power and was clearly a major industrial power, but it had a serious rival, and the rest of the world thought that, hey, this is not we kind of like this system. We like the Soviet Union. We may not like communism. But we like the fact that it's anti-Western, and we like the fact that they have this statist regime, not like the sort of the free market nonsense that the West is peddling. So if you judge it in terms of 1975 and now, I'd say the United States really has no rivals. No, there's no comparable rival to its hegemony, because the Soviet Union is no more. Russia is a shadow of the power that the Soviet Union was. Ultimately, of the 15 republics that comprise the Soviet Union, many of them are now very anti-Russian, and they've gone over to the Western camp. I mean, we know the 3 Baltic states. We've got Ukraine, Moldova. In the Western camp now. Georgia. Who knows what's going to happen in Georgia? But that's up in the air. Armenia now moving in towards the Western camp. Azerbaijan, which is close to Turkey. And then you got those Central Asians. Kazakhstan makes nice with the Americans and with NATO and so on. So that part of it is gone. China, is not really stepping up to the plate as a kind of major power, and offering itself as an alternative. Because if he was going to do that, the top priority that he should have is to form some kind of an alliance with Russia, but that hasn't happened. So I don't see the U.S. hegemony is in any way challenged in the way it was in 1975. Anyway, Art Brown says, like Great Britain 80 years ago, the world will know that the U.S. lost when it loses global reserve currency status. Yeah, that's very true. But it's using its way, its global reserve currency status, in a particularly vicious way, and that's why I think that could be challenged. But it's going to take a long time. I mean, you can't just get oh, hey, we'll drop the dollar and we'll adopt the yuan. It's just not. That's going to take a long time. So and I don't think we're anywhere close to that. That an alternative reserve currency has emerged. And then anyway, Dale, good to see you, Dale. Sorry I'm late. That's as long as you're here. George, I saw you had a look at that talk about the trial of Lord Haw, a travesty of justice. What is your take on the way he was treated? Yeah. Now, Dale posted a talk about Lord Haw, and I don't know whether people know much about Lord Haw. He was an American. He an American citizen. He'd spent time in Ireland. He spent time in Great Britain. He was a member of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. He had a falling out with Mosley, and then he ended up in Germany during the war, and he did a regular broadcast to Great Britain, which were obviously German propaganda, and so you could hear it. You could hear it on the BBC, and so his name was William Joyce, and he came to be known as Lord Haw, and his signature introduction was always Germany calling, Germany calling. Anyway, it was a couple of things were interesting. First of all, that the British made no attempt to censor his broadcast. So it wasn't a crime to listen, and people listened to what he said. So here he was presenting the alternative voice, and was presenting Germany's side in the war. And again, very different from the hysteria that we've had about RT, and we talked about it and what they're doing to Scott, Ritter, and they banned RT in Europe. In Great Britain, it's against the law to work for RT. So there was no problem with these broadcasts by Lord Haw. Now, when the British entered Germany in 1945, they seized Joyce, arrested him, and put him on trial. But this was always very problematic because they put him on trial for treason. And of course, how could he commit treason? Because he wasn't a British citizen. It was an obvious point, and that was the basis. That was his defense. They said, "Well, I'm not a British citizen. I'm an American citizen." And so the British got around it and said, "Well, yeah, but you had a British passport." But he did get a British passport, but he lied to get the British passport. By claiming that he was a British subject. And on the basis of that, he was sentenced to death, and he was executed for treason. Now, of course, this was an absolute outrage, because how can you commit treason when you're not a citizen of the country? I mean, the British really had no jurisdiction to try him. I mean, you don't like his broadcast. You don't like his broadcast. Okay, fine. But what makes that a crime? Oh, he was working for the enemy. Well, it's not an enemy to Britain. I mean, the Americans, if they wanted, they could have put him on trial, but of course they didn't, because they never heard his broadcasts. So anyway, the British put him. They tried him. He appealed, obviously, against his sentence and his death penalty. And of course, the British, with the hanging judge, they hanged him. And I think it's A.J.P. Taylor, in his kind of masterful English history in 1914 to 45, said that essentially his crime was that he lied on his passport application by claiming to be a British subject. And said, well, and Taylor ironically said, well, the penalty for lying on your passport application, is usually just, a fine. In his case, his punishment was hanging, and so it was an outrage. And but but there are many such things. Even I mean, this is separate, but P.G. Wodehouse had a kind of hard time. He's a great writer and everything, and eventually the British kind of relented and gave him all sorts of honors. But he had a hard time for a while because he also gave some broadcasts for the German, but not a political one. I mean, Joyce's broadcasts were propagandistic. I mean, there was no question. I mean, he was putting forward the German government line. But Wodehouse didn't do that. Wodehouse was captured by the Germans, and then he was interned, and then they took him to Berlin, and he made these a few broadcasts, not political in any way, but he talked about his experiences in Germany and what it's like to be interned. He was a humorous writer, and his broadcasts were humorous. But nonetheless, he came under a lot of attack. He was spreading German propaganda and so on. And so it was really quite touch and go after the war as to what was going to happen to Wodehouse. But he went to New York. He lived in New York, really, I mean, right through to the 1970s. But he never took the risk of going to Britain. He was never quite sure what would happen to him if he went to Great Britain. So he kind of lived in upstate New York after the war. Really, I don't think he ever returned to Britain. But I think Malcolm Muggeridge, who interviewed him, but Muggeridge was working for MI6, and so a lot depended on what Muggeridge's judgment would be on Wodehouse, and he wrote about it and said, it's so absurd to start talking about him as having committed treason, because Wodehouse just doesn't think in those terms. I mean, he's just a completely unpolitical person. I mean, he is, the kind of person that he writes about in his great works of literature, which is, he has a very humorous, ironic view of the world. He's just not interested in politics. So that and he said this. And I think Muggeridge's word counted for a lot as to why the British decided not to prosecute Wodehouse. Anyway, Cynthia says, Robert, what you say here makes sense. So this was about the nuclear weapons. Makes sense. China and India both have representatives of the pro-BRICS conference in St. Petersburg. Scott Ritter was going to speak. So Judy says here, the latest on the New York Times, may indicate the U.S. is starting to back down. In private, Mr. Biden's advisors concede that American and Ukrainian priorities are diverging. The Times then quotes from John Kirby yesterday saying, the White House answered, blah, blah. Mr. Kirby said U.S. policy against long-range strikes inside Russia has not changed. Well, I think what Kirby was saying, I mean, I know, Judy, you and I have had a slight disagreement on this. My view is that the Americans needed to just cross the Rubicon. They needed to sign off on Ukraine being allowed to attack Russian targets inside Russia by using American weapons. Once they signed off on that, then then it would be the next step, which is, maybe you can go deeper. And that's what Kirby said. Well, we have this, flexibility, adaptation. We can do this. We can, we have we're always on the lookout for adjusting our strategy. And I think that was what Kirby said. And so today they're saying, well, Ukraine has just used these ATACMS missiles to hit Russian air defense system, the S-300, S-400 systems in Belgorod. And this was a story in the Telegraph saying, well, we don't does that go against the Biden administration's stricture, because they said, well, it has to be only targets that are close to Kharkov and targets that are being used in the offensive against Kharkov. That was what the U.S. policy is. But of course, Ukraine's going to do whatever it says, and then of course the Americans will sign off on it. And so that's why when we moved on to the next thing, which is, well, now they've hit these air defense systems in Belgorod. Well, is that a violation of the American stricture? Well, of course it's a violation, but nobody really pays attention, because it was always inevitable that the moment the Americans put down a restriction, the Ukrainians are going to say, well, let's take it a step further. Because what can the Americans do? What are the Americans going to say to Ukraine? Well, that's it. We made a stricture. We told you what you can do. We told you our limits. You didn't listen to us. You didn't pay attention to our restriction. That's it. We're cutting you off. You're gone. Well, of course the Americans aren't going to do that. And then, of course, the Ukraine was going to immediately go beyond the restriction the Americans put. Well, everyone knew this, because the Americans are not just going to cut Ukraine off, because if they cut Ukraine off, then of course they cut themselves off. So it was obvious that this was going to happen. You're going to take it to the next step, because if you're going to just limit it to attacking Russian forces close to Kharkov, well, that's not going to make any difference. And everyone knows it's not going to make any difference. It's not going to defeat the Russians. So therefore, in no time, well, let's move on to the next step. And we already have the next step. Well, they hit the Belgorod. Well, is that a violation of the restriction placed on them? Well, of course it is. And of course, everyone knew it happened really within 24 hours, and it was obvious that it was going to happen. I didn't think it was going to be that quick, but yeah, I mean that's the way the Americans will always operate. Let me go back to Brown says, thank you so much. But yeah, thank you, by the way, Judy. That was very kind of you. Thank you. And Brown, thank you also. Appreciate your perspective. As an American, we think an American started everything. Yeah, Cynthia, and if you didn't already know, Larry Johnson is now in St. Petersburg to give a talk at the conference there. Yeah, but he talked about that previously at a conference that I was supposed to attend, but I didn't get my visa on time, which is kind of annoying. I didn't get it, so. But that's the one. There was a conference in February I was invited to, and then my visa didn't come through. Scum. And that's anyway. Cynthia asks, do you think that what happened to Ritter could very well result in RT being taken off the air in the US? Well, I'm always amazed that RT is still available in the US. So yeah, I mean, I would have thought it's RT is not going to survive for very long. But I thought RT would have been gone long ago. It's not available anywhere in Europe, as you know. Certainly not on the television. That it disappeared from all the cable packages in Europe long ago. But now you can't even get it on your phone or on your computer without the use of a VPN. So it's so yeah, I would have thought that RT is going to be very difficult to get hold of. But that's irrespective of anything to do with Scott Ritter. I think it's I mean it's one amazing thing that we're going forward with this this war against Russia. And we're losing the information war. I mean, we're losing the information war. We keep banning RT. Tiny group of people listen to RT, but apparently that's enough to lose the information war. So anyway, 60 cents says, "Dear Cynthia, RT America was already off the air in the US about 4 years or so ago." Well, 60 cents, welcome, and good to see you. I thought that myself. I mean, yeah, but I don't know. I haven't been in the US now for a while, but I remember when I was there, it was getting very, very difficult to see. I mean, I was living in New York, and I could no longer get it on any of the cable packages. We're not providing RT America. And Cynthia says, but I still get it here in the US, at least through the through the internet. Ah, okay. So yeah, okay, you can get it on the internet. Yeah, but you're not getting it as part of any cable or satellite uh, packages. Judy says, Belgorod was hit by HIMARS short-range missiles, not the ATACMS. And it is ATACMS that are the red line. Well, okay. There isn't a red line. I mean, I think that the issue is that the red line means the United States is going to somehow crack the whip on Ukraine. Well, it hasn't at all. And why would it? And that's why Ukraine has pretty much carte blanche to do whatever it wants, because the United States is now all in with Ukraine. And there isn't a red line. I mean, that's not true that there's a red line, because what the United States has said to Ukraine is that, well, this is how you use the missiles, but they haven't said, well, there's a red line, because if you use it in a way that's different, then we're going to do what exactly? So it's just it's like it's a kind of a pointless restriction, but it's not exactly pointless, because the whole point is to persuade the public that there's no need to worry. Remember, I mean, we're still inching towards a direct war with Russia. But so it's step by step, as we go from Trump overturning Obama's restriction on the use of the Javelin anti-tank missiles, very, very limited. So 2015, Obama says, nope, we're not going to use the Javelin. But so step by step, we go, oh, what, the tanks? All right, you can use the tanks. What about the these the man-pad missiles? So oh yeah, okay, well you can use that, and so on. So it's every step. The United States get more and more involved in Ukraine, and above all, in the way that using American weapon systems to hit Russian targets. So there is no red line. I think it's just a misnomer to suggest that somehow the Americans say, well, you can't do this. Well, what are you going to do about it? You're going to cut Ukraine off? Well, of course you're not. So the moment the Americans seem to suggest that, well, you can only use missiles to hit Russian forces that are involved in Kharkov. Well, the moment they said that, Ukraine said, well, that's not enough. That's no good. That's not going to win us a war. And then quickly the media repeat that. Yeah, that's not good. What are you going to do now? You're not going to win the war that way. We got to win the war. We got to defeat Russia. Well, so we got to defeat Russia. That means we got to use American missiles further deeper inside Russia. That's clearly the arc that we're heading down. Anyway, Anne-Marie says, what do you think would have happened and should continue to happen if Russia had not launched its SMO, but continued to allow NATO to expand further and achieve the West's alleged goals of balkanizing Russian regime change? In this case, not having a legal reason to take indirect or direct action against Russia, how would the West and NATO proceed? Well, it was clear that with the Biden administration, the the goal clearly was to take the whole of Ukraine into NATO. I mean, now that was said at some point in 20. So 20, I guess when was it? I think it was in the fall of 2021. I think in 16 when Lloyd Austin, October 2021, Lloyd Austin said the road to NATO membership is open for Ukraine. And I think that then it was just going to be a really in no time at all, Ukraine was going to be inside NATO. So again, that whole issue that people are putting, oh, you can't bring in NATO, you can't bring Ukraine into NATO as long as there are some parts of Ukraine that are under Russian occupation. No one was thinking along those lines, in October 2021, when Lloyd Austin said the road to NATO membership is open. So they were going to bring Ukraine into NATO, irrespective of Crimea and irrespective of the Russian presence in the Donbass. So they bring it in, and then they just simply say, but we don't accept the Russian presence. We're going to try to eliminate it, and we recognize Ukraine within its 1991 borders as the Ukraine that is a member of NATO. So de facto, which means that de facto there would continue to be a war between NATO and Russia. So I think that was the plan. I think there was no question as far as Ukraine was concerned. It was going to be brought into NATO, and there Russia would then be confronted with a real problem, because it has then a NATO member state of Ukraine. You got Poland, you got the Baltic states, and then you got Belarus. Russia's only ally really on the west is Belarus, and Belarus is under constant barrage, under constant attack from the west. Who knows? Whether they might succeed one day and toppling Lukashenko and installing, another kind of NATO puppet in Belarus. So Russia would have been faced with a very serious problem. Its entire kind of western front, western border, and we're also talking here about Moldova, would be NATO. And I think Russia would really have a real problem, particularly as NATO expansion was not going to stop, because again, they're moving into the Caucasus. We saw with ever since Pashinyan, who was brought in 2018. And then, of course, the NATO has ambitions within Central Asia, in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, it's still up in the air what's going to happen in Kazakhstan. So Russia was really facing, essentially, it would be encircled by NATO. And I think Russia really had to break out. I think it was a totally justifiable war, which is entirely what great powers do when they find themselves encircled, because you don't just get, I put it in that way, where they find themselves encircled. It's not, it doesn't just, happened one day. Quite well, absence, some in the fit of absent-mindedness, they find yourself encircled. No, this was a deliberate policy that NATO had been pursuing ever since the end of the Cold War, which is encircling Russia. Why do they want to encircle Russia? Well, because they intend to stir up trouble within Russia, use their presence on these borders, create problems, provoke conflicts, set traps for Russia. Well, why do great powers expand to the borders of their rivals? Because they want to instigate insurrections. They want to instigate insurgencies. These are things that the West is very, very good at. That was the goal. and then to eliminate Russia, as well. It's not that long ago since Russia was facing insurgencies within Russia proper. It was happening in the 90s. So all of that was coming, and I think Putin decided that he had to break out, break out of this circle. So I think it was a perfectly justifiable war, and it was a provoked war, it was a justifiable war. How Russia did it, that's a different question. And I think that, I've obviously been critical of the way Russia set about doing it, but there's no question Russia really had little choice. I mean, it was more and more pinned against the wall, in which you either you essentially cease to be any kind of a great power. You are encircled, and therefore you're at the mercy of your rival, who can then do whatever they want, mount insurgencies or whatever. Or you try to break out, break out of the encirclement. Well, that's very dangerous, because then you go to war, and wars are very unpredictable, and who knows what's going to happen. So I think Russia was in a kind of in a very difficult situation, and by February 2022. Anyway, Denrock says Russia needs to shoot down at least the drones that fly over the Black Sea prior to Western strikes into Russia. This would be a way of proving some point without human loss. I agree. I think the drones. I think then you can attack satellite, AWACS. Those are the things you do first. You attack the weapon systems, and then you kind of put America on notice. Well, what are you going to do about it? Because you remember when Iran shot down the Iranian drone, and then all the blowhards in the Trump administration said, "That's it, bomb Iran." And then Trump was about to do it, and then Trump then decided, well, that's not really proportionate. Because if you you attack a drone, okay, you've destroyed some hardware, but it's not proportionate then to go and destroy human lives. So I think that's exactly right. I think you want to first of all hit American weapon systems or satellite systems, which are clearly being used to help Ukraine targets in Russia. That's the first step, and then you ask the Americans, okay, what are you going to do now? How far do you want to take this? Because we're ready, but you need to do something. You can't just allow this to drift. So anyway, Judy says, not the US red line, Russian red line, as announced in their current tactical nuclear weapons drill at UK military facilities in response to Cameron's remarks about Ukraine using Storm Shadow long-range missiles. Well, I don't really see why would Russia want to resort to nuclear weapons? I don't see what the gain is. I mean, I think Russia has a number of steps before that. I think, to be honest, a lot of the bluster that's coming from Russia isn't particularly because what Russia's it's no point in making exaggerated things like you're going to hit Downing Street and you're going to hit whatever. It's just I think you should take measured steps. Now I don't know why Medvedev does this. I don't know, but I don't think it's helpful to go down that path. Then Douglas McGregor points out that Eisenhower wanted as big a neutral buffer between the USSR and USA precisely to remove a war trigger. No, I think that's right. I think that's exactly what you would need. So yeah. Red Oyster says, I caught your stream live. I have nothing to add to your infinite wisdom. Thanks for being a sober, albeit sometimes very depressing at your analysis. Yeah, well, that's the way it is. I mean, I'm presenting a depressed outlook because yeah, things are pretty depressing. Anyway, announcer foreign affairs, maybe an odd question. As a child, one of my favorite books was a story of a young Hungarian girl in the midst of pre-1956 events and vast tensions between the lives of the young hip of Buddha and Pesh. Can't for the life of me remember the author or the book name. All right, can you help? Yeah, I think I know what the book you're talking about. Yeah, but I'll think about that. Yeah. So anyway, let's see if there's any, been in Rumble. So let's take a look. I mean, I'll be looking at all the great questions here. Yeah. So okay. So the ones on Rumble. Yeah, they're the same as the on locals. I thought there were different people putting forward different. So these are all questions that I've already not all of them. So some people are saying. Coop says Samuel is the king of gaggling. Okay, that's very nice. Thank you. But it says just got the notification an hour late. Oh, sorry about that. I know. And then someone says, I heard everything a year or more early on RT before USA News. Keep hearing about the opioid crisis on RT, but never heard on CNN and BS TV networks. Yep, that's right. Yeah. All right. So some of these I've already seen, but not all of them. Chanel says Israel murdered Raisi. Well, it's what you would think. I mean, I don't have any evidence for that, but I don't have any evidence that Israel murdered Yasser Arafat. I've always assumed that was the case. I mean, you'd have to be a fool not to assume that Israel was behind the sudden death of Yasser Arafat. But I don't know about Raisi. I'd like to see some evidence of that. Anyway, let's see. So the incompletist, I like that name. Napolitano wasn't apprehended. Ritter suggested he pulled out of the trip, never went to the airport. Okay, so he's not going back. And then again, it says Scott Ritter warned the judge not to try to fly. Okay. And then someone says, does the British royal family have any say in how and world politics? I don't think so. I don't think. I mean, I actually think the royal family haven't done much for Great Britain. I mean, I've talked about it at length before, but they've made their own lives very nice. Their life is very, very nice. But they haven't done much to make the British people's lives very nice. So they like the idea of a great long tradition going back to the 13th century. So we had all that during the coronation, which was quite impressive. Well, there's Edward the Confessor, there's King Edward II, and it was very, very impressive. And then you realize, well, how about the British people? They might like the maintenance of their tradition. They'd like to kind of somehow live in the same country that their parents lived in. They'd like to live in the same country that their grandparents lived in. So they'd like a little bit of that tradition for themselves. Hey, this is where, Edward the Confessor. Instead, everything is just being taken away from them every day. No part of Britain is in any way recognizable. I mean, it's all so different from, they think, hey, it wasn't even like that when I was a boy, let alone when my parents were children. So the royal family have done very little for the British people. Anyway, Putin showed, apropos of Trump and Ukraine, he says he agrees with Trump wasn't the key player, but he caved on Ukraine aid, doesn't bode well. I agree with you. I mean, I don't think his role was honorable. On the other hand, one shouldn't exaggerate it, and I think my point was that Michael Tracy somehow says, it was Trump. Trump was the key figure in that $61 billion aid. It wasn't. I mean, he wasn't in any position to stop Johnson from doing what he was doing. Johnson was going to do it, and Johnson knew he had the votes. And by and large, the Republicans, they weren't persuaded to support the package. So more than 50% of the Republican conference in the House voted against. But given that 100% of the Democrats, the votes were, it easily passed. But none of that really has much to do with Trump. Trump just wants to maintain good relations with the party leaders. Well, he is the presumptive nominee. I mean, it makes sense for him to try to maintain good relations with the party leaders. I mean, what happens when he becomes president? That's a different story. And then again, maybe it was Trump who greenlit the package for Ukraine. I just don't. I think he wants good relations with Johnson. Johnson was going to do it with or without him. He let Johnson do the running. Johnson speaker, Trump isn't. Trump is the he's not even the anointed nominee. So he just said, okay, do what you want to do. But in any case, it's not like, well, the Republicans supported it because Trump supported. The Republicans didn't support it. So they, I don't think it persuaded all that many Republicans to support Johnson because Trump said, okay, well, Johnson's doing a good job, which is all Trump really did. He just said, okay, well, Trump's doing a good job. So that I don't know what it means in terms of what he's going to do as president. And, going back to the point earlier, what Orban claims Trump will do, which is to cut Ukraine off. I don't know whether that's true or what Trump's plans are for Ukraine. And I don't know, we can speculate about that, but I don't think this necessarily shows that he's going to continue the war in the way Biden's continued it, but it doesn't prove the other case either. Anyway, I think my time is up. I've been doing this for a while, so thank you. Justin Maverick says Trump won't do jack. All right, it's possible. I don't dispute that, but I don't think we can. I don't think the evidence is in yet on that. Anyway, thank you everybody who has joined me. Thank you for all of your interesting questions and opinions and ideas and arguments. So that's what this is about. So it's always a lot of fun. We'll do this again on Thursday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, good night. Well, it's night here. Look forward to seeing you on Thursday. All the best. Bye-bye.